What's up? In this video, I'm going to be going through a new plugin for implementing the MA3 recast function on MA2. Now what the recast function does is it allows you to take a preset or effect that you have programmed into cues in your show file already and restore them into those cues. And this can be advantageous for situations where you have added attributes to a preset. So for example, if you have a gobo preset where you only had gobo wheel 1 included and you need to include gobo wheel 2 everywhere that gobo was stored previously, now that you have added that to the preset, this will do that. This will find every sequence, every cue that preset was previously used in, and restore it only for the fixtures that had used it back into those cues. So there are a couple of different ways that this can be implemented, and I'm going to go through a few different scenarios throughout this video. I'm going to go through actually 4 different test scenarios to demonstrate this. The first one, we are going to go through a lot of the setup on how to use the plugin as a whole and what all the options are going to do. And then the next couple of scenarios will just be showing it in a different setting. So here we go. All right, so the first situation we're going to get into is going to show re-implementing that same situation we just talked about, where we're going to take a bunch of cues where only gobo wheel 1 was used, and we're going to add gobo wheel 2 in using the same preset. Now I'm going to go into using the plugin first, and I'm going to put the user config stuff at the end of the video. If you're watching this on YouTube, it should be broken up into markers at the bottom. So if you want to just skip to that, go ahead. But for right now, I'm going to start off with just running the plugin. So we've got a sequence here, and we can see that in each cue for the first 5 cues, I'm adding one new fixture into using a specific preset. Actually, let me reset this. So we have a blocking cue, a Q5 here. And then down to Q7, we switch to a new preset. All of this is happening on gobo wheel 1. So what I want to do is recast a gobo preset 227 into all of the cues where it was previously used, and then have it not track into the following cue because there's a different preset there. Now, if I'm recasting all of these, that won't really matter. I'm going to show first, not tracking forward, just for situations where, let's say you've got a pan tilt preset and you want to add a zoom anytime just that preset's in use. That's more the scenario I'm showing this particular thing for. And if you're adding attributes to an effect, there are situations where you just don't want the new attribute to track through. So I'm going to show that first, and then we'll get into tracking through. So we're going to click our plugin here, and we get a couple of different options on our menu. By default, usually you should be able to run it with all the defaults. We're not going to worry about action sets yet. We'll get into that when we hit the user config stuff at the end of this video. The next setting down is cue only mode. So this is the mode we're going to want to use when we don't want information to track forward past where the preset was previously used. And to give a quick explanation on what this is doing, you'll see some of this happening as the plugin's running. But what it's doing is it will find any sequences that are using this preset or effect. I'm just going to say preset. You should just assume that I mean both when I say it. It's going to find any sequences that are using that preset, and it's going to go into a world that only includes the fixtures and the attributes that preset can or effect can support. From there, it will block all of the sequences. So if you're not familiar with what blocking means, it means that instead of storing into this queue and just having it track through the next few cues and just have it be there because it was stored in a previous queue, it's going to be storing that value into this next queue. That's what the white means. And then it'll store into the next queue. So when I run this, I'm just going to go ahead and start running it in queue only mode. And well, we have target range. That's sequence start, means all sequences. So we can go ahead and move into recasting it. So I'm going to say recast, and we're going to say preset 3.227. And before it gives us our pop-up here, we can see that all of those values that were magenta before have turned white, which means that this preset has been stored in every single one of these cues instead of just tracking forward. That becomes relevant at the next step, because what it's going to do is every time it sees that a fixture is using that preset, it is going to go ahead and store, in this case, cue only into that queue. What that means is that once we reach the end of the range of queues that it was affecting will get a release tag thrown in if it wasn't already in something in this queue or in some preset or value before the range of presets that we're recasting. So if that doesn't make the most sense now, just keep watching and hopefully it will make a little bit more. Hopefully I haven't minced the words too much there. So I'm going to say OK. And it's going to go through some search and replace functions, and we say OK. And we can see now all of these fixtures that we're using gobo wheel 1 added gobo wheel 2 for that preset because, again, they were all able to use, if I grab fixture 401, they were all able to use both gobo wheel 1 and gobo wheel 2 information on that preset. Then when we reached the end of this range, it put in a release tag. Now if we go back in and do, oops, it's the wrong thing. If we do the same thing for preset 3.228, which is our next gobo there, we will see that gets added in anyway. So it doesn't, in this case, it doesn't matter that it was going to track through, but in the case of an effect, something where you're adding attributes in, but you don't necessarily want those to track on forever, especially effects actually, or you might want them to be stomped, and we're going to see that later on. That is where that becomes more relevant. Now, one thing to note, two things to note here actually. One, we can see 401 had a dimmer channel that was blocked the entire way down, and I put that in there just to show that that was not affected by this operation. So we did lose our blocked value on Q5, so if blocking is very important to the way that you've programmed your shows, this might not be the best thing to approach with. So just be aware of that. But what's it called? Break mode in a queue stack still works. It can't affect that, but blocked values will be lost if they match the same sequence and the same attributes that are in the preset or effect that you are recasting. So just be aware of that. But I added this in just to show that since we entered a world that didn't include dimmer, because again, it's just a gobo preset, so there's only gobo information in there. So when we entered that world, there was no dimmer information available. None of this was affected. So just so you know that not everything that's blocked is going to get hit by this, just things that are in the same sequence and the same attributes. Hopefully, I think I've hit that like 3 times now. Hopefully that's clear. Okay, so I think that handles this demonstration. We're going to go ahead and move into the next one. All right, so the next situation that I want to dig into are situations where you might want to apply a delay, specifically where a certain preset was used. For me, this has come up when using certain strobe fixtures. I don't want to throw anything under the bus, but let's just give it a hypothetical name like a Nitro 510C. Sometimes you get a strobe fixture that when you put it into a random strobe, they all have to flash on first before they hit their random times. Why? I don't know, but that's the way it works. So in those situations, you might find yourself wanting to go and apply a delay time so that they all enter their random strobe at different times so you don't get that one big flash on first, because I personally find it a little bit jarring. Maybe I'm just a picky pain in the ass, whatever. In any case, to apply that delay time to all these, we can, again, use the recast function. So what we're going to do is create a random strobe time and then apply that everywhere that this preset was already used, because delays don't get referenced in presets on MA2. In MA3 they do, in MA2 they do not. So first thing is, let's add in some, actually, you know what? I've already done the random delay time. You grab your fixtures, you shuffle your selection order, you turn on your align, and you turn up your delay just a little bit, and they'll all be at slightly different times in random order across the rig. So that's what I've done to create the delay times here. So now I'm going to apply that everywhere. So right now, if I grab them and put them at this preset, my fixtures, and put them at this preset, if we go and check a fixture sheet, we can see that we have a bunch of values varying from 0 to should be 0.14. So now we want to apply that everywhere. In this case, that's 1 queue, because I wanted to make sure the example was still readable. So I'm going to hit recast. And in this case, we are not going to use queue only mode, because we only care about applying these delays to the queues where the preset was stored. We don't need to add this delay to every single queue that the preset tracks through. And in theory, delays don't track. They do, especially if you're on timecode, and I don't know why, because they're not supposed to, but they do sometimes. But for the sake of discussion here and for all purposes of practicality, they don't. So ignore everything about tracking delays. Point is, we don't need them to track. So we're going to turn off queue only mode, and we're going to, again, we're going to hit every sequence that this preset can be found in, and we're going to keep our original action set. We're going to recast preset 5.1. And when we do that, it'll find it. We say okay, and we're done. Now, if we look at our tracking sheet here, we can see that all those queues that just had this preset before now have a delay layer, which is showing down here. I could have just used that. And we're going to see 0.1 and 0 across the path. If I do select fixtures Q1, and we look, I'm going to go to Q2. If we look at our delays here, as I cycle through these fixtures, we can see that we do indeed have the values stored at their original values. They just only show to 1 decimal place in a tracking sheet. There's probably a setting I missed for that. But anyways, all the values are there. So now, anywhere that we had used that random strobe preset, it has added those delays in for us. Again, that can be really handy. I've run into a lot of festival rigs where you have to do the selective shutter preset thing so that you can get them all at slightly different values. If you're not familiar with what that is, you just grab all the fixtures that you want to be in a random strobe. This is for fixtures that don't have a functioning random strobe. You can find a sync strobe speed that's about where you want, then do that same thing. You shuffle your selection order, you turn on the first level of a line, and then you just tweak your shutter speed just a little bit so they're all at slightly different speeds. And this isn't something I figured out. Some house guy showed this to me. And you end up with varying different speeds. So then you can combine that with adding a delay time to all of them, and your strobe should enter a random strobe as expected. So that's how you accomplish that. All right, so we are into our first effect that we are recasting. Now there's a couple of things that I want to show in this portion. 2 things specifically. 1, why we use queue only for adding attributes, another demonstration of that. And 2, the differences between stomp and release when it comes to effects in a queue stack. So right now we're looking at a queue stack where we have all 4 of our color attributes in the value layer. So if you do a color transform, you should be seeing this. But we only have red, green, and blue in the effect layer. So we're going to fix that. So we're looking at effect 1190 here. And we have added in RGB5, which is the white attribute. So let's run recast on that. But we're going to turn off queue only mode, just so we can see why we don't want to do this. Again, for actually doing this, you will want to use queue only. I'm demonstrating why not using it is a problem. So we're going to recast the effect. We're going to say effect 1190. It's going to find all the places it's used. We'll say okay. And what we can see happened here is that it went ahead and added it in full in Q2, where red, green, and blue started. However, in Q5, red, green, and blue had a stomp, but that's not an effect. That's not effect 1190. There was nothing to store there. So white tracked on through in the effect that it was already running. And we can see it is still effect 1190 just for that parameter. So if we say select fixtures Q, and we work our way through this, we will see, let's go look at our value layer. So we see them moving here. And when we get to Q5, we see that only white is continuing to implement the effect. I'm going to guess that most of the time, a vast majority of the time, probably all of the time, that's not what you want. So let's reset this. And let's do it again with queue only mode. So queue only mode is on. We're going to recast effect 1190. We'll find the things, block the things. We say okay, does the things, and there we go. And now the effect only runs for the first 3 queues. And if we do select fix queue again, we can see that we go from the effect in Q4 to no effect running in Q5, which is what we wanted. Now the only thing to look out for here, and I don't even know that I want to say look out for, but is that we are going to be using a release tag instead of a stomp. That's because anytime that you store something queue only into a queue and that attribute wasn't previously being influenced by the sequence, it puts in a release tag. Release means it is no longer under the control of this executor, which in the case of a queue stack will function the same. It means that that effect has stopped running. There is no effect running on that attribute anymore. In the case of a single queue stack, that acts exactly the same. The only thing you have to look out for is if that stomp was put in place to stop the effect activity on an attribute on some other executor as well. If that's not the case, and again, if you're queue stacking, the vast majority of the time this won't be the case, you're going to be fine. The only thing to look out for might be for a bump button. So just look out for that. But again, in a bump button, if you've got auto stomp turned on that thing, it will probably already be doing what you need in that regard anyways. I just wanted to bring this up in case it is of supreme importance to anybody. For 90+% of situations that anybody will be using, this is going to work exactly as you expect it to. So next, we're going to take a look at the same idea, but adding fixtures in instead of attributes. All right, so we've hit our final example, and this is going to be adding in the full fixture selection available to an effect when we recast that effect. I'm, to be honest, not entirely sure what scenarios I would be needing this in, but it was easy enough to implement, so I just went ahead and did it. So right now, what we have is a queue stack where in Q1, all these fixtures come up. In Q2, just the downstage fixtures go into this dimmer effect, and in Q3, we are stomped out. What I'm wanting to do here is anywhere that that effect is used, that effect from Q2, which is effect 1191, I want any fixture that could use that effect to be using it. And then I want it to stop using it once these fixtures are no longer using it. So I'm going to hit recast. And for this one, we're going to change our action set. So I'm going to click on this guy. And instead of recasting just our original fixtures, we're going to recast all possible fixtures, which means, again, we see that the effect is used somewhere. We're going to say, what fixtures can this effect influence? We're going to grab all of those, and then we're going to store them at that effect into the same queue. We're going to keep queue only mode because we don't want all those extra fixtures to track forward with this effect. And we're going to keep our target range of all possible sequences. Let's hit recast. We're going to say 1191. And does its thing. All right, and we can see first off in Q2, all of those fixtures got put into that effect. And then in Q3, the original fixtures were stomped out. The new fixtures go into a release, again, for a single queue stack that is the same behavior. So now when we go and look at our layout, we see Q1, they're all just here. Q2, they have all gone into that effect, for which we have added separate lines for each of those. And then in Q3, they stop. Again, I really can't provide specific scenarios where this would be wanted because I feel like this is something you'd be putting on a separate executor if you're using it this way, but I figured I'd introduce it just in case. It was a very easy thing to implement, so I just went ahead and did it. So there's that. So having shown what the plugin can do for adding in new attributes from a preset or effect into your queue stacks, I just want to go through the configuration and then just some little warnings and limitations of the plugin. So first, the user config. Let's go take a look at that. So we've got, I'm going to pull this up in the text editor just so it's easier to read with the color coding. We've got some settings at the top. By default, this will all work just as is. It should. If you have anything specific in mind, then you can get into that. But let's just go through. So these first three default values, these are just what the values are when you run the plugin here. So that we're defaulting to action set 1 and queue only mode turned on and a range of sequence star. That is all set in here. These are the default values. If you change them here, they will still be possible to edit when we run the effect. They will just have different starting values. So just to demonstrate that that is what they are doing, I'm going to go, why did I go through all that? I'm going to change this to false, just so we can see. So now when I run this, we are starting off with queue only mode disabled. So that's all that is. Let's go back to the text editor. So for the default range, we're going to work on or apply the preset or effect to, whether or not we're defaulting to queue only mode being turned on, and which action set we're using by default. Which brings us to the next section, the action sets. So these define what the plugin does every time it finds a match in a queue for the preset or effect that you are recasting. By default, what we're doing is we're selecting original fixtures, which means the original fixtures of the queue. We're going to put them at the preset, and I use preset here. There's explanations on what all these things mean down here, but preset Could also mean effect if you're working with an effect. That's just the wild card I went with. It'll put them at that preset or effect and then store back into that queue. That is the default behavior we're going to be wanting for a recast situation more often than not. Whether or not we're using queue only mode is defined up here, which is why I've set this as a wildcard so we don't have to worry about syntax in this. Then we have our second action set, which is adding all fixtures in there. So instead of selecting the original fixtures, we're going to select fixtures for the preset or effect, which means we're going to grab anything that can use that preset or effect, put it at that preset or effect, and then store back into the queue. So if you want to go through and create your own custom ones, if you have something really specific in mind that you want to do, feel free to play around with these. Again, all of the wildcards have been explained down here as to what you can do with it. That said, I am not providing technical support for these. If you want to get this deep into the nitty-gritty of it, have fun. I wanted to make sure it was available, but I am not supporting that because that has a lot of room for error. So don't play with this if you are not confident in what you're doing with it. I offer no guarantees to that, and please save before you run the plugin. Next down are our telnet settings. So I didn't explain this earlier, probably should have explained it earlier. What the plugin is doing in order to perform these search and update functions is it is actually logging into the console by telnet. So the plugin logs into the console it's running on by telnet so that it can read the search results, because by default, when you run a search operation, there's no way to take the information returned from that and put it into a file that Lua can read. So to get around that, I did a telnet login so that everything that shows up on the command line when you perform that search operation can then be funneled back into Lua, and then I could work with it from there. All that to say, that is why telnet's involved. So the response timeout, this is explained farther down below. Again, all of these variables are, but the timeout is how long it waits before checking what MA responded with. If you start running into issues where it's saying that no fixtures were found, and the error message for this even tells you to do this, then increase the time here. This is especially necessary if you're running this in session, which I don't recommend doing. I'll explain that in the next section. But just so you know why it's here, again, you really shouldn't have to mess with this, but I want to explain what it's doing here. And the last things are the username and password that are being used to log into the session by telnet. I would only edit these if you need the search operation to be happening from a specific user. This only affects the search. It doesn't affect the store operation. So if you're in a world already when you run the plugin, it doesn't matter what user you're on. If you're in a world already when you run this plugin, the store operations will respect that world or filter. The search operations though will still find the effect or preset for any fixtures that could have been using it. So if you really need to like slim down what the search operation is doing, if you're working with a really massive show file, then this can become relevant. Again, unless you're running into major bottleneck issues and just really needing to optimize this, I wouldn't worry about these either, but I left them here just in case. So that's the user config settings. And then next, we're going to talk about just some general do's and don'ts and caution to take with this plugin. Alrighty, so before we wrap up, just want to go through some things to be mindful of when using this plugin. Number one, save. Please save before running this plugin. There are a lot of operations that this thing performs. Every time it finds the preset or effect used somewhere, it grabs the fixtures, puts them back at that preset or effect, then stores back in, then clears out. That's at least 4 operations every match. And if you've used a preset, I don't know, 100 something times in a show file, 200 something times in a show file, this is queue counts. It doesn't go up for number of fixtures used in there. Point is, if you used it in a bunch of queues, you are adding that many more operations, which means your undo queue gets massive. And probably the last action you manually took is well outside the scope of it. So save before you run it so that if you perform a recast that you don't like, you can just revert to a previous state. And you're not stuck wondering where your last working option was. You might waste a little bit of disk space creating a couple of backups between each use. You can always delete those plenty easily. Next up is when to use queue only and when to not use queue only. I would recommend using queue only when you are adding attributes or adding fixtures to a preset. So if you only used gobo wheel 1 before and now you're using gobo wheel 1 and 2, use cue only mode so that gobo wheel 2 doesn't track forward where it wasn't supposed to before, or the new attribute on an effect doesn't track past when the rest of them stomped. I would recommend using I would recommend not using cue only when you're adding a delay or maybe a fade anytime a specific preset is used, because we don't need to apply that delay to every possible cue that happened in. Next thing, I would not recommend using this plugin while in session. The amount of time it takes for the network to update what each fixture is doing across all stations drastically slows it down, as opposed to just having all these operations run from one station and then joining a session again to upload that to everything. I have seen speed differences from just working on a console that was in session with an on-PC. It ran maybe at half this, so it took about twice as long. With this computer has a pretty hefty processor, so it took it maybe 6 times longer when it was in session. So I very highly recommend leaving session when you're running this, just for speed purposes. I'm trying to think. I think there was one other thing. Oh, don't use ranges with this. So right now I would like to in the future add a couple of features. I would like to add ranges so you could do effect 1 through 50 and have it figure out the same process for every single one of those. I am wanting to add a couple other things. When it finds one preset, tell it to apply a different preset on top of that instead. Again, other little ideas that I think will help make this really useful, but I just wanted to kind of get it out in the form that it is right now. All of that to say, multiple effects or presets at once are not supported. There are some safeguards built in so that if you type affect this through that or affect this plus that, it will warn you that that is not allowed. If you find a way past that, don't expect that it's going to work. It's just going to do not the thing that you're expecting it to do. So just want to bring that up. And that should be it for our little warnings and observations here. So if I have made a compelling case as to why you just absolutely need this plugin in your arsenal, feel free to download it from my website,jalfadesigns.com. The link should be below. You can also contact me on my website and on my Facebook page to hit me up with any suggestions, comments, criticism, hate mail, let me know why my cats don't love me, whatever. And yeah, hope it helps some people out. This is a feature that I've personally wanted to see for a while. I am excited to see that it'll get implemented on MA3. Also excited to see when that will be in a show stable state. But anyways, just something I've wanted for a while, so I'm hoping it will help some other people out as well. So have fun programming, everybody. I'm just kind of excited to see us getting back to doing some shows. So catch you later.